Welcome to Flight Club. We take off
We
soon.
can talk now. I hope nobody can
Make
hear
yourself
us.
comfortable. We recommend getting a drink and headphones.
Can you hear me?
Yes, headphones are essential.
But
The first rule about Flight Club is you do talk about Flight Club. The second rule about Flight Club is you do talk about Flight Club. This flight will never stop. Welcome to Flight Club. Welcome to Flight Club. This flight will never stop.
Flight Club. Flight Club. Flight Club. Flight Club.
Welcome to Flight Club. We take off soon. Make yourself comfortable. We recommend getting a drink and headphones. Yes, headphones are essential. The first rule about Flight Club is you do talk about Flight Club. The second rule about Flight Club is you do talk about Flight Club. This flight will never stop. This flight will never stop. Welcome to Flight Club. We take off soon. Welcome to Flight Club. This flight will never stop.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Flight Club. My name's Klaus Leopold, and I'm the co-host of this show. And today we have a fantastic guest, an old friend. He is old? No, an old friend. That's okay. Dan Vacanti. But before we go to Dan, Cliff, please say hi.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Flight Club. So yes, as Klaus is saying, we have a fantastic lineup this evening. We've got some interesting conversations planned. And as some of you were asking online earlier today, would we be drinking? Because, of course, Dan is normally hosting a podcast called Drunk Agile. It's a fantastic show. You should check it out, by the way. But yeah, the question was, will we be drinking? And of course, if Klaus puts all of us on our screens, we can show you actually what we are drinking, which is interesting. So I have a wonderful whiskey. I think, Klaus, you have some rum, and
No, it's a whiskey.
Oh, we all have whiskeys. We all
I
have
mean,
whiskeys.
I also have a rum.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe I want to switch in
Yeah.
between. Who knows?
Yeah. So for those of you who would like to join us, feel free to grab a drink and join the show. It'll be perhaps a slightly different or more relaxed by the end of the evening than perhaps what we're used to. But yeah, cool. So lots of people joining from all over the world. Lovely to have you joining us this evening. Today's topic, we are talking about how to think in bets. I suspect that some of you have perhaps written the book that we shamelessly stole this title from, or borrowed this title from. The wonderful Annie Duke has written a book by this title. And of course, we're exploring this topic of what does this mean? So, how do we take into account more information and consider kind of a more probabilistic approach than perhaps just thinking in a linear fashion? So, before we get into too much detail, I want to remind all of you that are joining for the first time, please hit the like and subscribe button if you enjoy the show. It really would help us out to get kind of the word out there and have more people joining us. And of course, you can join the meetup group to get announcements and so on about future events and so on. I will point this out in the chat in a few minutes. You'll get a link that you can click. So yeah. Our guest this evening, Mr. Dan Vacanti. It's wonderful to have you here with us this evening. Thank you so much for joining us, Dan. So for those of you who don't know Dan already, he is the author of a couple of books. He's done all kinds of fascinating things, but the current way that we introduce him is to say that he is the co-founder of prokanban.org. We will talk a little bit more about prokanban a little bit later on for those of you who are interested. But Dan, do you want to say hello and maybe just tell us a little bit about what's exciting to you in the current climate?
I don't know if I can do both of those things, but I will definitely say hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. And I'm glad I could be such a bad influence on both these gentlemen. And I hope all of you have brought one of your favorite drinks with us. These types of conversations are always much more fun over alcohol, so I highly recommend it. In terms of what really excites me right now, I think it's probably what we're going to be talking about tonight. How do we get out of this kind of deterministic thinking mindset, this deterministic, planning type mindset, and start thinking probabilistically? Because what we do, knowledge work in general, is dominated by uncertainty, and so being able to make decisions under conditions of imperfect information, I think, is not only crucial but a necessity, a requirement. So, really looking forward to the conversation tonight.
Cool. So let's open up the topic. I think some of us have probably heard of probabilistic thinking. That's a nice sentence. And I haven't even had more than a sip of whiskey yet. So let's see where this goes. Cool. But some of us have probably heard about this concept. But let's unpack this a little bit. So if we kind of position probabilistic thinking sort of as sort of the opposite or a alternative to linear thinking, maybe you would phrase this slightly differently. But how would you explain the difference between probabilistic and linear thinking, and where would you say that probabilistic thinking is most applicable? What's kind of the context where it's useful?
I'm assuming that's a question for me and not for Klaus.
Yes.
I'll jump right in. Yeah, linear versus or linear as an alternative to probabilistic. That's probably an okay way to frame it. That the way that I would explain it is kind of along those lines. Is to me the essence of probabilistic thinking is acknowledging that there is more than one possible future outcome. That's if I could encapsulate probabilistic thinking in one statement, it's just that acknowledgement. As I was talking about before, the future is full of uncertainty. In that future, there are many possible outcomes, each with their own chances, of happening, as opposed to linear thinking. I think what you were alluding to, Cliff, where people assume that there is only one path and there is only one option, and there really will only be one outcome. That's just not the way well, I should say that's not the way that my world works anyway. In my world, there are always many possible outcomes, and being able to understand the risk associated with all those outcomes and be able to make decisions, as I was saying before, being able to make decisions based on our understanding of that risk, is really where I think probabilistic thinking comes into its own. I guess that's why I think we need it so much.
Mm. So I guess at some level, part of the challenge that I see a lot of folks, and I guess for myself as well, this was when I first started understanding like the world of systems and probability, and the fact that, as you say, there could be more than one possible outcome, was trying to understand whether or not we're in a situation where there would be one outcome, or simply because perhaps I can only imagine one possible outcome, that I assume that we are in a linear kind of a scenario. What do you kind of think about this, or how do you tell people to like, how do I say this? Like, if you're trying to sort of understand how to think about the difference between linear and probabilistic, like when would it apply in that sense? How would you recognize if you were in a situation that might have more than one possible outcome?
Well, I think that's why we stole the title from Annie Duke. I mean, I think that's really what her book is all about. And I think we need to start thinking like gamblers, whether we know it or not. Every decision we make is essentially a gamble. For the poker players out there, I mean, this. As you're playing poker, you're trying to make the best decision you can with like I said, imperfect or incomplete information. So I would say, anytime you find yourself in that situation where there is some type of uncertainty, some type of information that is lacking, some type of understanding of context, of whatever, anytime there is any level of uncertainty, which from my perspective, that's pretty much all the time. So anytime there is any type of uncertainty, that's where you have to, by definition, you have to take a probabilistic view of the world. This whole linear deterministic thinking just goes out the window, in that case, because there's no such thing as 100%.
Mm. I think this makes a lot of sense, and I see so many times that scenario where we sort of, I think a lot of planning, especially sort of in the strategic world, but even in a project context, we sort of assume as if we could plan somehow towards some kind of, we imagine this plan as I said earlier, we imagine that there is only one outcome, and so we design kind of a system that makes a lot of assumptions. And then, obviously, as you say, reality comes along and it has some slightly different ideas. And then we end up getting frustrated. Why didn't you plan properly? Or why didn't you, forecast the future better? This kind of thing. So I kind of see this happening fairly often. I'm curious to sort of look at this from the lens. So we had a quote inside our description of today's session. And it says, the biggest risk, this is a quote from Annie Duke. It says, the biggest risk in thinking you have a winning is in thinking you have a winning strategy, when in fact you have a losing one. And I think this kind of captures a little bit of the essence, but I'm curious, Dan, what are your thoughts on, what is some of the sort of things that we get wrong when we think about strategy and planning in this kind of a context?
And I do have to say that is probably my favorite quote, of the book, and it's one that I use all the time, and it's one of the reasons why, and I'm hoping we'll talk about this later. It's one of the reasons why I like to say. Actually, I steal this from my co-host of Drunk Agile, Pratik Singh. He likes to say, you need to understand how wrong you are as quickly as possible, right? That's really what Agile's all about. That's really what Lean's all about. Anyway, like I said, I hope we come back to that a little bit later. But all the things you were talking about before, Cliff, I think is anytime you come up with a plan, so we're doing Scrum and we're doing sprint planning, or we're doing SAFe and we're doing PI planning, or we're doing just any type of release planning or any type of planning or whatever, getting locked into that idea of, oh, we got the plan, it's a plan, and because it's a plan and because we worked on the plan, then everything's going to be wonderful. That's where you're going to get in trouble, because you're assuming right out of the gate that you have a winning strategy. And as Cliff, as you suggested, reality usually says otherwise. And so that's why I think it's so important to understand, as we get more information, because we are doing that planning, we are doing that forecasting, we are doing that whatever exercise when we have the least amount of information. So as we get more information, that's why I think it's just fundamental to take a look at that information and say, okay, hey, based on this new information we're getting, do we really have a winning strategy, or don't we? And adjust accordingly. I think that's, again, this is something we'll get into a little bit later. It's one thing to get that information. It's quite another thing to adjust based on that information, which I think is even more important. I'm not sure if I answered the question, because I'm a few drinks in too. So, but I'm just going to ramble.
I think it's interesting, because part of what I see as the challenge is exactly as that quote captures, is that you think you have the right idea or the right plan, when in actual fact you don't. And I think part of the challenge often is that we don't necessarily realize or are even open to the idea of taking into account that new information. And so I'm curious, maybe you've had some experiences with this. And Klaus, I know you've worked in this space a bunch as well. What have your experience has been on how do you get people to make that shift from kind of feeling like we need to have like the answers before we start, or that whatever we have are actually the answers before we start, and kind of moving more to a space where we're okay and comfortable with the fact that we might not actually know where we're going to end up exactly, or some things might change along the way, and this kind of space. Because my experience is that often that's quite a scary space for people to be in. We create a plan partly to give ourselves some sense of certainty, as if that were somehow going to make it a reality. But how do you get people to sort of shift from that space of just being, we plan everything linearly, to somewhere where we're actually comfortable with the fact that we may not have all the answers?
And I think I can weave in a question here. So Hilda said something similar, actually. So she's like, okay, she likes the idea of being a gambler, but how do you explain this to your CEO or to your stakeholders? They don't like to gamble that much. I mean, maybe in their free time, but not when it comes to business outcomes.
I mean, if I can jump in on that, I mean, whether your CEO knows it or not, whether your stakeholders know it or not, that's exactly what they're doing. As a CEO, you're a gambler. As a stakeholder, you're a gambler. If you're investing in something, you are a gambler. And that's why I think taking the gambling mentality is so important, because the CEO doesn't have all the answers. The stakeholder doesn't have all the answers. None of them can predict the future any better than you can, which is, and by the way, if they can, they're in the completely wrong business. And I would love to talk to them. Anybody out there who can predict the future with 100% certainty, I'd love to talk to you, because I've got a lot of business ideas, around that. But the simple matter is, simple fact is, us mere mortals can't predict the future with 100% certainty. And so the sooner somebody recognizes, hey, if I'm investing time, if I'm investing money, if I'm investing whatever resource that is, you're gambling. You are. And so I would say embrace that, rather than kind of shy away from it. Embrace that fact, and learn from people like Annie Duke who do this professionally.
And I mean, yes, we are gambling. Totally get this, but I think all gambles are not alike, if this makes sense. So, for instance, if I'm going by train from A to B, especially when you're doing it in Switzerland, chances are quite high that the forecast is quite okay, right? That's a little bit different when we launch our new whatever product. And I would like to wave in a question here again from FB Storf. I guess it goes into this direction, right? So are we at work always working with complex adaptive systems? So, how can we know when our forecasts or our future? There's not always the same amount of futures, if this makes sense.
Yes.
That's what I just say. What do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, because one of the classic examples I love to give, and again, I'm gonna steal from Pratik. Maybe you guys should just have Pratik on, and maybe I should just go home because I just I steal all his best stuff, but it's so few and far between. So I guess I can do it. So a lot of times I have people think, and the train analogy is a good one. I have people think about back in the days when we were commuting to work, and hopefully they'll come back soon, or maybe not. But back in the days when we were commuting to work, I would always have people think about, all right, how long does your commute take? And people will always, number one, they'll start thinking in averages, and they'll say, okay, on average about 15 minutes. So Klaus, to your point, then I would follow that up with, let's say that you had a meeting with your CEO at 8 o'clock, and this meeting with the CEO was to talk about your promotion or your whatever, so some big thing or whatever. If you had to make that meeting at 8 o'clock, when would you leave? Right. And most people at that point say, like, yeah, at that point, they don't say 15 minutes anymore. They'll say something like, something probably more like an hour before. And that's getting to the point I think that you're making, Klaus, in terms of, yes, there is variability in terms of that risk, that those futures that we might be planning for, and understanding that risk and the variability associated with that risk absolutely should inform our action, and absolutely should inform the decisions that we make in terms of when we're going to leave for work to meet with our CEO, or when we're going to start a project, when we're going to stop a project, those types of things. So I know, again, I hope that answered the question, but yeah, I mean, like anything, context is king here.
I think it's interesting because what you touch on there is kind of this idea of bringing some data to the conversation there. We've got some historic evidence or something that says, well, the train takes this long, and also, what am I prepared to risk? We know sort of how much am I prepared to bet that the train is going to run on time when my career is on the line for that meeting, kind of thing. So what it reminds me of is a lot of the time when we're doing these kind of sessions, with a client, or in a context where you're doing some sort of product discovery kind of work or something, we often talk about this idea of surfacing our assumptions. We need to get clear on what are the things that we're making assumptions about, and what are the probabilities of those. I guess my question is, like, what are some of the things that we need to understand in order to be able to do this? Like, if we're trying to get better at getting our assumptions clear, what examples do you have of how do we actually go about, knowing if we've got all of the assumptions out, or if we got enough data, that kind of a thing? Yeah.
So I don't know if I can speak to every scenario, but the work that I've been doing has been focused mostly around this idea of the context of knowledge work, and developing products and knowledge work, doing planning and knowledge work, and things like that. And so that's why I firmly believe there are certain elements in your process that you have to have put in place, so that you can capture the right data, so that you can take the action that's needed, when that data suggests that there is action needed. And again, this is a whole rabbit hole that we can go into. By and large, I believe, and I don't mean to denigrate Agile in any way, but by and large, Agile historically has failed to put some of those things in place, which is one of the reasons why I kind of gravitated more toward the lean side of things, the Kanban side of things, and it's things like, just having a clear understanding of what does it mean for work to have started, having a clear understanding of what does it mean for work to have finished. Tracking the time between those points, tracking how many things we are finishing per unit of time. Some really, really, really basic some really, really basic data can give us tremendous insight in terms of the health and performance, of our process. So I don't know how deep we want to get into all of that, but that's to me that's the point. We need to set our process up. We need to set our system up for success, for predictability. We can't just say, hey, whatever, let's all get together and sing Kumbaya and hug, and everything's going to be fine, right?
I mean, when you're asking how, go ahead, Tiff.
Go for it. Go.
Okay, just when you're asking, okay, how deep do we want to go? I think we can put Phil's question in. So, how much data do we actually need? So, what is enough?
Yeah, I don't. Just so you know, Phil, I don't answer any questions from people named Phil. So I don't. That's kind of my rule of thumb. Uh, that again, that's a big depends as well. Most people assume. Let me talk in generalities if I can very quickly, and then we'll hopefully talk in specifics. But most people assume that you need a ton of data in order to get started with probabilistic forecasting, probabilistic thinking in general. And by and large, you need a lot less data than you think you do. A lot less. Again, I'll get into maybe specifics in just a little bit. The bigger thing that you really need to worry about is now let me take a step back. As a general rule, it's hard to argue this that in general more data is better than less data. Generally speaking, that's true. But there's some big caveats to that. Big caveats. One caveat is that the future that we're trying to predict roughly has to look like the past that we have data for. That's in order for this probabilistic forecasting that I talk about to work. That certainly has to be in place. And so that's why I wouldn't say, let's go get more data just for the sake of getting more data, if that more data that we're getting looks nothing like the future that we're trying to predict. So that's one caveat. And then generally speaking, because of that, kind of a follow-on corollary to that is more recent data is generally better than less recent data. So just because you have 5 years worth of data doesn't necessarily mean that 5 years worth of data is going to be better for you. So again, depending on context, depending on what you're trying to forecast, if you're trying to forecast something like, hey, when will this item be done? You really don't need that much data. You need somewhere around, as just kind of, back of the envelope calculation, somewhere around 10 to 11 historical data points, and you're pretty good. You're off to the races. If you get up to around 20, you're about as good as you really need to be. But as I mentioned before, to me, it's less about the data itself, and have you put in place a process that is going to allow you to be predictable, that's going to allow you to trust the data that is coming off in order to make those predictions. I'm waving my hands a lot. I feel like we need a whiteboard or something like that, so I can explain this in a little bit more detail.
Or you need a whiskey in the other hand as well, so that you keep both of them busy, perhaps.
For sure.
Yeah, that's what I just noticed. So usually I'm drinking water, but this has a different effect on my body. I don't know.
Cliff, you were going to jump in with something. Was there something you were going to say?
I was going to say something, but I'm going to talk about something different now, actually, because I think you touched on an interesting point, is that if you're trying to measure something like predictability or gather data from a system, one of the things that I find fascinating is how people try to gather data, as like historic data or any data for that matter, about a system that is not actually somehow, I mean, in the Kanban world, we might talk about this concept of a stable system or something. But essentially, if you work in an environment where your work items could be anything between 10 things and 500 things at any given moment, the level of predictability that I think you can get from that, it's going to vary quite wildly. And I'm curious, Dan, what's your experience in that sort of a sense? Like, do you tell people sort of start with the predictability side, or do you rather start with the side of trying to make some kind of a stable or a predictable system, if you will?
Believe it or not, usually the answer to both of those questions is the same. So to answer your question, I guess directly, I would say I would do both. I usually come at it from the predictability side, because by the time my phone rings, that's what people are looking for. That's what they're craving is predictability. And so I kind of have to come at it from a predictability lens. But the thing is, all the things that you would do to put in place to get better predictability are exactly the same things that you would do to stabilize your process, and to get your process in a position where you can be more predictable. They're really the same thing. So, and that's one of the things that I think is it's a rather cool result from all of this, really. If you understand one, you understand the other pretty much.
I think that's interesting. Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about forecasting now. Maybe I just share a story, and I would like to see what you think of this. So I remember back in the days when I was like teaching Kanban, I was teaching like a standard Kanban class, and I was like doing forecasting, and you can do great things with it, and you predictability, and you don't need so much data, you just need the right data and everything, and do all these great Monte Carlo simulations, and everything would be fine. And my customer was like, well, yes, we understand this, we can do this, but we give a shit about it. So we have 3 dates in the year. There is Christmas, there is 2 trade shows where we need to show up, and we always meet these dates. So we just don't care. So that was somehow one of the reasons why in the flight levels world, we don't go in like, okay, work on a stable system and stuff like this, because it is important, of course, when it comes to predictability. But predictability is not always the main goal. So we try to approach metrics actually from a different side, where we say, okay, what's the problem we're trying to solve here? And let's see if we're making progress towards this goal. And the goal might not be predictability, if you know what I mean. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, and I absolutely agree that there are contexts out there where predictability doesn't matter. I would probably argue that those are fewer than the cases where predictability does matter. But in the situations,
Yes.
in the context where predictability doesn't matter, this is where I always, I come back to my definition of professionalism. And I mean, that to me, that's kind of table stakes. When you show up, I believe you should show up as a professional. And my definition of professionalism is when you show up at work every day, you have a fundamental belief that you can get better, right? That's it. That's all I'm looking for, right? Is that you really believe. Go watch. If anybody's into sports documentaries, you go watch any sports documentary, whether it's Last Dance by Michael Jordan, whether it's about the one about Tiger Woods, whether Serena Williams, Rafael Nadal, any of these, you will see the common thread across all of those is they show up to training every day and they're like, I believe I can get better. And so that's my answer would be, in those contexts where you don't care about predictability, I still hope you care about improvement. And as I was trying to say to Cliff before, the metrics and the data that I'm going to have you track to get better at predictability are also going to give you tremendous insight in terms of where you can actually improve your process and where you should be investing your time and effort in order to improve your process. Because the thing is, if you don't care about either of those things, improvement or predictability, then I can help you. And to be honest with you, I'm not interested in helping you if you don't care about either of those things. So,
but I like this. I mean, so we phrase it like this. So what are we going to improve here? And let's come up with a measurement. And if the kind of improvement is predictability, we need to work on this set of things in your system. If you're optimizing for something else, we should do something else.
Yeah. I've often had the conversation with people, and I've raised this point a few times, is this thing of like, if you're thinking through it, you need to first understand the problem that you're trying to solve. And then the question kind of becomes, so if you had this data and it moved in some direction or another, so let's say we were measuring lead time and it went up by 50% or it went down by 50%, what would you do differently as a result? And that can be a helpful way to kind of test and get a little bit of a sense of like, is this actually a meaningful metric that you're going to do something with? And I think often what it helps people to do is kind of narrow in on something that's like, well, we want this metric just because it makes us feel comfortable versus we're actually going to do something different with it. Because I think exactly as you say, we say, oh, well, this is the outcome that we're trying to achieve. And if we don't yet know exactly what we would do differently, it doesn't make so much sense to try to get more data, because we may be able to tell it with the data that we have already, or even just avoid spending too much time on gathering those metrics.
Oh, your mute functionality works perfectly.
Sorry, Dan. Yeah, I did. So shameless plug along those lines, Cliff. way back when I started a company called Actionable Agile, and the reason that I called it Actionable Agile is that I don't necessarily care about data, although it sounds like I do care about data. I really don't care about data. What I really care about is the action, how the data might inform the action that you're going to take. And so if you're collecting data and that data doesn't help inform that decision, or worse, you're not using that data to help inform that decision, then, like I said, I'm probably of very, very limited help to you.
So there's quite a few interesting questions coming up in the chat.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask
Also
the one
scanning it.
Helen Palmer is asking. She says, could you give some examples about eliciting hypotheses-focused outcomes at the inception stage? So when you're kind of kickstarting the work, how do you get a good hypothesis out of the discussion as opposed to just a set of deliverables, if that makes sense?
Yeah. And this is where I'm probably going to lean on both of you to help me out, because, like I said, I'm less concerned about the hypothesis, although I'll talk a little bit about hypotheses here in just a second. But I'm less concerned about the hypothesis than really the process of validating or invalidating that hypothesis as quickly as possible. So in terms of coming up with a good hypothesis, one thing that I would say is, obviously you want to make it as small as possible, but be meaningful. And there is data that I can give you that will tell you whether your hypothesis is, quote unquote, the term we like to use is right sized for the system that you've developed. Is your hypothesis right sized? How you write a good hypothesis and how you do all that, to be honest with you, that's really outside of my area of expertise. But what I can help you to do is, once you have that framed, let's talk about how we validate or invalidate it as quickly as possible, because I think that's really what we care about. I don't know. Can either of you help me? Because I'm floundering here. Help.
I would echo that as well. I think a huge part of it for me is the first step is to get in the habit of writing it down. I mean, Annie Duke talks about this a bunch when she talks about the concept of resulting. And basically what you want to try to do is at least just have a sense of, well, when we went into the situation, what was the information that we were using to make this decision? Because we had some assumptions. If we deliver this PlayStation feature by date X, then 100,000 more customers will sign up and we'll be all billionaires and it'll be fantastic. Okay, cool. And then what you can do is, once you've written it down, you could start to work and measure against it later, but you can also just do something as simple as a smell test. And something that we used to use quite often actually at Spotify was this idea of just kind of publicizing and making the thing transparent, because then what you're able to do is you're able to get other perspectives from people within the company. You can look at that and go, hang on a minute, I'm not sure that makes sense for this fairly obvious reason, given some useful information that I have. Or I just don't understand what it is that you're actually trying to achieve with this thing. And it doesn't make sense. Like, I don't understand what we would actually do differently as a result. And so I think often kind of going through this process, as you say, of trying to really validate whether or not the assumption is correct, rather than worrying if it is a correct one, if that makes sense. It's somehow like related, but perhaps a little bit different. Building that process to be able to kind of get some feedback as quickly as possible. And I think really the key thing for me here is that it's about eliciting and soliciting feedback and information from other people and other places, whether that's customers, your development teams, your project management folks, the finance people who do the budgeting, your marketing team who look at this and just go, that's a nice idea, it's totally unfeasible because this problem is already solved over there. And you'll be amazed how often you can actually shortcut an enormously expensive bet by just talking to the people who are already inside your company, who'll go, here's all the reasons why that's not a feasible idea. And you still have to make a decision. But if you capture that and you go, well, this kind of information was presented to us, we still decided to do it because we thought it was worth the risk. We can at least then look back down the line and go, okay, we thought there was a 10% chance of failure, but we've placed 100 of these bets and none of them have worked. 10% is probably a little bit of an optimistic kind of success rate. So we should take some learning and insight from this situation. At least I would hope that people would take some insight from this situation.
And maybe Kevin's question, Kevin Rush, hi Kevin, by the way, fit somehow into this. So what are some significant ways how we can hedge our bets when delivering in a complex domain? What are your thoughts, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I sound like a broken record. I know, but it's but I mean, it is to me. To me, it comes down to, you know, to me, the best thing you can do to hedge your bet is to make it as small as possible. It's one thing. I think Annie Duke talks about it in her book. Maybe I'm getting it from somewhere else, but it's something that a lot of poker players talk about. This they call it bankroll management. I think it's called bankroll management. And the idea is, you don't go the first hand that you see. You don't go all in. You don't necessarily go all in on the very first hand you see. It's like it's you want to be able to sit at that table as long as possible. And generally speaking, that means placing many small bets. It doesn't mean placing one huge bet. So in terms of hedging, number one is I think generally smaller bets are better than bigger bets. But then number two, and anybody who's seen me talk and anybody who's taken my classes or whatever, there are certain metrics out there, like for example, work item aging. That you take a look at, because as items age, as you're working on items and as they age, you gain a ton of information, about them. And so, hedging your bet based on the age that, hey, this age is giving us a signal that there is something wrong and we need to do something. That, to me, that's the ultimate hedge, is taking action when appropriate.
Okay, so aging and small sizing. Now, I think I have a tricky one, I think. So when we are working like on flight level 3 is like strategy, right? And if I'm taking a bet like, shall we enter the Latin American market or shall we enter the Asian market? This is not exactly small, I think. So what would you suggest in a domain like this, where it's really like huge topics?
Yeah, I mean, I would still think there's a way to decompose that bet into smaller bets, where you could say, okay, what is the smallest? We want to enter the Latin American market. What is the smallest thing that we can do to understand whether that's the right move for us or not? It's not like we're just going to go, like I said, we're going to just go all in on Latin America. Again, I'm not saying that that's necessarily a wrong thing. I'm just saying over time, I doubt that that's going to be the most profitable thing. So that's when you're at flight level 3, and again, I'm way out of my depth here. This is where I need both of you to help me out. I'd still think there is a way to decompose those flight level 3 things into smaller kind of reasonable steps that we can start to validate. All right, is this thing really the right thing to be doing?
Yeah, I think part of what I've seen is the challenge with that kind of scenario is that the motivation for why we need to enter that market is because all of our competitors have already entered that market. And to me, like, the part of the challenge with that is that if you're playing exactly the same strategy and the same plan as everybody else, you're probably going to get fairly similar results to everybody else. And most people are what they think they're actually trying to do is beat the odds. And if you're trying to somehow outperform the other people, playing the exact same strategy is unlikely to get you a very different result. And so I think part of what it needs to be is not being contrarian just for the sake of being contrarian, but actually understand how is it that your entry into that market can do something somehow different or something particularly special. But I think a lot of the time is that the rigor of strategic planning and actually capturing assumptions is quite frankly just not done, or not done nearly enough. It's sort of I have a gut feel that we should do this thing, and so we do it. And I think this is sort of at some level kind of human nature, because I've heard it said multiple different times, is that as human beings, what we do is we think that we are rational. We look at some data, we understand the evidence, and then we make a decision. The reality, however, is that actually, as we use our rationality, or the way we use our rationality, is much more to make a decision and then use our rational reasoning storytelling ability to construct a narrative that justifies the decision we've already made intuitively. And I think that's helpful to understand and to know, because you're somehow combating that on an individual level, but also kind of on a group level. At some level, all of the strategic leaders and the people in the project management team, from your software developers to yourself to whoever else, they kind of do this quite a lot of the time. And so knowing that is kind of helpful, because what you're often trying to do is surface, okay, what were some of the assumptions or the underlying things that we can try to then pull into the discussion and say, okay, when would we need to change course, or what would we do when we hit 50% of this, or how would we know if this was working or not working, and designing your hypotheses and your activities around, as you said, or as you said that Pratik was saying, you need to understand how wrong you are as quickly as possible, and I really like that framing of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And to me, this is, and don't get me wrong, I love empiricism. I'm a big believer in empiricism. Obviously, I am. But I think in practice, empiricism fails because, just as you were saying, Cliff, people do not behave empirically. Like you said, they want to make themselves the hero of their own story. And so, in the face of real evidence to the contrary, they will behave irrationally. They will always come up with a justification for why that didn't work or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. If I had a really good answer to this, and this, by the way, this is why I love. I mean, in my spare time, I just read behavioral economics stuff. That's pretty much all I read anymore. But if I had a great answer to this, I'd be sitting on a beach counting my money somewhere. I wouldn't be talking to you guys. I mean, I might be. We'd maybe be sitting there drinking together or something. But I'd love to come up with an answer to this problem, because I think it's one of the more fundamental ones that faces our any industry right now.
Mm.
Yeah. I think this has particularly interesting implications, just to sort of extend on the topic, is that, I worked at Spotify, and a lot of people talk about how famous Spotify was and look at all of the things that they've done. Obviously, if we got what they did, we would be successful as well. And I think it's okay to take some inspiration, and for sure, looking at what others have done before you makes sense. But the challenge is that the one thing that we discount in this, and Annie Duke talks about this quite a lot, is the role of luck, right? Is the thing that made Spotify successful their organizing principles, squads, tribes, and so on? I mean, I think it plays a bit of a role, but if you didn't do any of this, would they have been successful? The short answer, I would say, is most probably yes, because the thing that made them successful was not only one or two things. It's often a business model level innovation. And so I think it's quite fascinating when you look at these things. We tell a story about, oh, company X or Y was successful, or that leader used this investment strategy, or whatever they did. But that's basically us doing exactly what I was talking about before, constructing a narrative that explains the choices that we made and the outcomes that we've achieved, not necessarily taking into account all of the causal and relational factors. So it's worth kind of taking this with a little bit of a pinch of salt. It's helpful to look and see what other people are doing, but don't treat it as gospel, or if you copy and paste verbatim, that somehow magic and ponies are going to come out of your organization as well. Yeah. Cool. So I'm talking a bit about this thing. I want to actually jump across to a couple of questions. There's quite a few people who are asking for recommendations about books.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we were
So
always
I'm-
talking about Andy Duke's book, but I think even Dan wrote the book. Is this correct? Or even maybe two?
Yeah. So I am. How do I don't even know, because I'm not a technologist.
Send it to us in Slack and we will post it to the chat. We know that
Okay,
you're not so skilled in the technical domain.
So I mean, that's. I just sent you one. So I've got one book called Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability. I think that's the one that most people are familiar with. That's really written kind of in more of a textbook style to introduce the metrics that are important. The second book, which I would argue is probably the one that, even more than the first one, that you should be reading, is When Will It Be Done, which just goes into the basic principles of forecasting. How do we take that, all that good data, all those good metrics that we are measuring from the first book, how do we take that and turn it into a reasonable probabilistic forecast? That's what the second book is really all about. So, and then my other, if we're talking about behavioral economics, my other favorite, I think it is my favorite in that realm, is Misbehaving by Richard Thaler. If I was going to have anybody on this read one book on behavioral economics, it would be that. In terms of getting out of linear thinking that Cliff was talking about into more probabilistic thinking, to me, that's the law of averages. So I don't know if we can put the law of averages up there too.
That's a good one. Yeah.
That's a book that helps people kind of shake themselves out of, because that's the problem with the linear thinking, is because usually people are thinking linearly on average, which is one of the worst things you can do for all kinds of reasons that Dr. Savage goes into.
Yeah, it was really cool when reading it. I was like, oh yeah, shit, that's the average. I hadn't thought about this.
So,
And it was
so many
so
times,
often. Yeah, it was
so
like,
many times
oh.
we calculate average and we think, oh, it's average. The average outcome
Yeah,
must be what's going to happen. When the average outcome rarely happens, and
yeah,
sometimes it's impossible to happen, right?
yeah,
So yeah.
yeah. I really like this book. Cool.
It's a little bit of an slightly incorrect in the nuance statement, but I heard the saying that like if you're betting on the averages, the problem with it is that you're wrong at least 50% of the time. And I quite like this because it captures exactly that point: is that like the average is not correct all the time. It's exactly that. It's a distribution of averages, or distribution of data points that give you an average. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
worth thinking about that.
Yeah, we can tweak it a little bit because I think Dr. Savage, he says something like this in the book. He says plans based on average fail on average, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we can say that without even getting into percentages. We know
Yeah.
that if we're planning based on an average, we're going to fail an average amount of times. And is that really how you want to do planning? Is you're actually planning to fail an average? Now it turns out you'll actually succeed an average amount of times too. But as Cliff was saying, the percentage where that average falls, might it might be 50%, but it probably isn't. It's
Yeah.
probably something radically different than 50% for an average.
Yeah.
Let me bring in another question. I like this
Okay.
one. Hilde van Peel asks, okay, we have 3 forecasts within 3 years, and right now the planning ritual is for 3 years. So how do we convince our controlling department that we're not able to plan the next 3 years? Hello, Corona.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's a wonderful example. A lot of people on this call have maybe seen, because I live in South Florida. I like to talk about hurricane forecasting. We're not doing hurricane forecasting out 3 years in advance, even though hurricanes are literally life and death, right? I mean, we're talking about literally life and death scenario. You never see the National Hurricane Center come out with a 3-year forecast for hurricanes. I mean, they might make broad sweeping statements. So my answer to that, usually when somebody comes in and says, hey, somebody wants me to put together this 3-year plan, my answer to that is always, there's no reason why you can't do that. Of course, you can put together a 3-year plan, but you can't be surprised then when that 3-year plan is wrong or it needs to change. And so now the question becomes, why are we investing so much in something that we know is pretty much going to be wrong and we know needs to change? There might be a good answer to that. There probably isn't. There might be. And so that's what I would say is, I mean, there's in any of the things I talk about, you can do long-term planning with it for sure. Absolutely. But you have to be prepared to change. You have to be prepared for that thing to be wrong, and you have to be prepared to change. You can't get upset when you have to change.
But I think that's exactly the point. So I must admit, I really love plans. So it's not that I'm really like planning something to the latest detail or something like this, but I really need, I work like checklists and plans. That's my world. And for me, it's just like a possible future with some deviations in it. And I always iterate about it, over it, and I change it. So I think the planning aspect depends on how much time you, of course, and time and money you invest in it. But the plan per se is not a problem. It's just like, that's how we think we could work. But then the more important thing that we need to adapt. And I will again go back to the domains. So coming up with a 3-year plan for a train company, a train schedule is probably a little bit easier than for a startup company. In I don't know what domain. Right?
Probably, but like you said, I mean, we still have Corona to deal with, right? We still have
exactly, but the chances are higher
Exactly.
that we are closer, but there's still multiple futures.
Yep.
And there's actually a plural of future. I
Yeah.
I really Googled it. It's this really multiple futures. You can say this.
For sure. Yes, you can. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think something to Hilda's question that I found can be helpful with this is if you've heard of the concept of a cone of uncertainty, if you imagine it that sort of things quite far out, sort of on the front end of the cone, we can kind of plan these or predict them at some much sort of more rough level of granularity. So, for example, if you're trying to plan for retirement, you know that when you turn 65 or 70, you're planning to retire, and that if you save at a certain rate, you will kind of end up wherever you are in terms of your pension. But what you can do is you can zoom a little bit further forward and say in sort of 3 chunks, one far out, one medium term, and one kind of near term, and keep kind of moving your planning horizon a little bit further forward. So what that means is that you still have a very loose long-term plan. You have a sort of a slightly more crystallized medium-term plan and a much more detailed, like, what are we doing right now plan. And what you do is, as you move forward, maybe over your 3-year horizon, every time you move forward by 1 quarter, you plan another quarter into the sort of long range plan, and you plan another quarter into the detail, and you plan another quarter into kind of the sort of the more mid range plan. And something like this captures for me both a sense of like the uncertainty about the future, but also this idea that we pass over the thing and adapt the plan multiple times, because it's not a static planning process. Now, I know that there are some obvious flaws with this kind of planning process, and I would question a lot of the time, how useful is it to actually try to even plan at all for 3 years from now? But as Klaus says, sometimes what's helpful is that process of going through, thinking through, how do we actually get from A to Z, not just from A to B, actually helps you to validate, wait, actually, we don't know how we're going to get there, and we have no idea what the path is, and whoa, there's actually a lot of forks in this road. We could go many different directions. And so helping to do this, I think, it helps in the process of kind of understanding where you might possibly end up.
And I think that's exactly what flight levels also tries to address, and especially flight level 3, right? So yes, it's awesome that in 3 years we want to achieve all these outcomes. But what does this actually mean for the next year? And what does this mean for the next 3 months? And when we're talking about months, we somehow reach flight level 2, where we can derive concrete actions out of this. But the thing is, it's not that we're doing this 3-year plan and then we try to execute the plan. It's more like this. Okay, that's what we want to achieve in 3 months. And each and every week we're checking in and seeing, okay, are we making progress towards what we are trying to achieve? If not, well, let's think what this means, right? Do we have to adapt the plan or what is it? So I think it's really like this breaking down. Dan, I guess that's what you also said before. Try to downsize everything, right? So that's exactly what you're doing with flight levels. That's the reason why we have 3 levels, actually, because it's about different time horizons in the end. And adapting, adapt. And that's the reason why we also have to check in on a weekly cadence on a strategy level. Because we need to adapt. Yeah. That's how it is.
Done. Next, world
All
hunger.
problems solved. World peace and everything.
So I'm just looking at the time, and I'm wondering, maybe we should talk just a few minutes about, Dan, what you've been doing with Pro Kanban and some of the conversations we've been having about Flight Levels Academy and Pro Kanban and so on. Shall I just hand it over to you and say a few things? Tell us about what you're doing in the Pro Kanban world.
What is Pro Kanban?
Yeah, no pressure, right?
Sure.
Yeah. Pro Kanban is all about developing a community that where it is safe to learn, where it is inclusive, where it is diverse, where an opportunity for anybody who wants to come and learn about Kanban can. I think for all kinds of reasons that has been lacking. For as a solution for Kanban for many years, you could argue since its inception. But that's really what Pro Kanban is all about: is how do we foster that community that can be safe, inclusive, and diverse to learn about these things. So and we try to touch on all of this stuff that we've talked about in this chat, and that is. The reason, by the way, the reason it's called Pro Kanban, not necessarily that we're for Kanban, which of course we are, but Pro Kanban is actually short for professional Kanban, and that's why this idea of professionalism is such a big deal for me. Maybe you could probably hear that coming through. I was a little bit passionate about the ideas around professionalism and what professionalism is, because I believe that's so fundamentally important to any practice. So, Klaus and I, having gone, and now Cliff, having gone, way back in the Kanban community, obviously the way that we see the world is very, 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 very similar. Maybe other than what we drink, but in terms of how we approach process. And so, I think what our 2 organizations are trying to do are so complementary. They reinforce each other so much that it's kind of a slam dunk. I think that we do these types of things together, and maybe some type of other partnership in the future, whatever it is, right? But that we kind of keep building these bridges, to understand that, hey, there's no one organization, there's no one methodology, there's no one framework that has a monopoly on all the good ideas. So let's all keep talking together, and let's all learn from each other. So I don't know if I did a good job with that or not, Cliff. What else do you want to add?
I think that resonates a lot with what we're trying to do with the Flight Levels Academy. I mean, we host events like this, and really want to try to make it so that we bring a lot of different folks together and learn from different and diverse perspectives. And so, as much as like inside the Flight Club show, it's the three of us in today's episode who are talking, and others asking questions, which is sort of an interesting kind of a dynamic. But that ability to kind of give access to different ideas and kind of challenge thinking, people provoke stuff from what they say in the conversations on the chat and that kind of thing, but really provide ways for people to be able to contribute to something, because I don't see flight levels in the same way that I don't see really anything in the world is completely done. What we want to try to do is involve people and say, like, okay, well, what are the challenges that you're facing? What have you found that's working in your context? How can we learn from that? How can we adapt to that? And so with the Academy, just like with the Pro Kanban, building the community, which you can sign up for on our website, hosting events like this, offering the workshops and training courses, and trying to really keep things as accessible and available to people as possible. Because I think at the end of the day, for me, sort of from a philosophical level, I've encountered so many organizations that I've worked in and that I've worked with as a consultant, where people are having really not such a great time because of a combination of just bad process, bad thinking, or bad leadership. And what we want to try to do is bring good quality thinking, good quality process, and good quality leadership to those conversations. And I think for the most part, people haven't had access to that information. They haven't been able to learn it because, unfortunately, a lot of the prevailing ways are just kind of, they overpower, and we learn things through the school system that maybe don't kind of connect in the same sort of way. So we try to make the world a better place. If that's not sort of like I guess that's the Miss Universe kind of answer. I want world peace and all of this. But I think this is. Yeah, I think this is something that's actually achievable, and I think we see this. I mean, all of the people that are joining us today are here because they believe in the same thing at some level, that we can make better organizations, better work environments, better world, better products, better customer experience, all of these kind of things. And so I like to think that in some small way we're contributing to making the world a better place. So that excites me. Yeah. So we will, of course, continue our conversations about possible future collaborations and how we can connect these topics together. But before we go, I want to just make sure to thank everybody for joining on the stream. And I have one more question to Dan as well. Before we head off. But to thank everybody for joining us today. It's really wonderful. Thank you for joining us. It would be super cool if you like this content and you like what we're talking about today. Hit the like button, hit subscribe, share the meetup with your friends, tell people about this. It really is cool to get your feedback, and that's one of the best ways that we can get a sense of what's working for you, what you're enjoying. I would also just like to point out that for those of you who are interested, join the community on the flightlevels.io website. There's a little sign up button in the top right. Just jump on there. It's completely free to access. There is a paid version if you want, but it is completely free as well. Jump in. You can post suggestions. Who should we talk to next? All kinds of things, and kind of shape the future of these conversations and discussions. So, sales pitch and ad break aside, I would like to ask one last question to Dan. So we've talked a lot about some ideas here. I'm curious if you think, sort of, imagine you're having a conversation with someone who's just starting out for the first time with probabilistic thinking and trying to sort of think in bets. What would you kind of give as tips or advice? Like, where do they start? How do you get going in this space?
I should have a pat answers for that, shouldn't I?
Read my book.
Honestly, yeah, no. The book I was going to say that, honestly, if somebody's really, really interested in this, really passionate, the book that I'd probably hand them would be The Flaw of Averages, because that was probably the one that shook me up the most. But then the thing is, you have to quickly, it can't be just read a book. I think you have to quickly, and this is why I was kind of hedging a little bit. This is why you have to quickly follow that up with real actual practice, and you have to implement it. The only way you really get good at this, because humans are terrible, I think, and we've kind of been dancing around the side of around this, but humans are terrible at thinking probabilistically. We're just hardwired to not think probabilistically. And so that's why you do have to practice. And so, not that I would necessarily shameless plug read my books, but certainly a lot of the concepts in there, they're very simple, basic data and metrics that you can start out with that will give you a good understanding of variability and uncertainty in your process that you can start practicing doing some of this probabilistic forecasting with and get a feel for. Okay, I was maybe planning with only a 30% chance of being successful. What does it look like if I plan with more an 85% or whatever 70% chance of being successful? So that's what I would say. I mean, like, very first step, probably read for law of averages, but very quickly follow that on with implementing some type of concrete practice with it.
I know the question was targeted to Dan, but I would like to add one thing, and I think that's a cool closing statement from Piotr, who cites a very great philosopher. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Mike Tyson. So that might be a good
figures of our time.
Yeah, might be a good advice to start as well as a guiding principle.
I think that's fantastic. Cool. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been wonderful to have a conversation with you and drink some whiskey. I've enjoyed the preparation conversations and so on as well. It's really been great fun hanging out with you. So thank you so much for joining us. And I look forward to a time in the future when we can get together. Who knows, maybe we could do this even in Edinburgh and we can drink some whiskey at the Source and do something like this. That would be a lot of fun.
It would be, yeah. So thanks to both of you, Klaus and Cliff, for putting this on, all the effort that you do to put this on. But I think mostly thanks to everyone who showed up and stuck around. This was a lot of fun. I hope we get a chance to do it again sometime, like you said, sometime very, very, very soon. So yes. I'm just grateful to people taking time out of their day to come watch us, and then certainly for Flight Level Academy for having me here. So thanks for that.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, and good night, everyone. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. We're talking next time to Natalia Schwartz from Riva Digital. We will be having a conversation with her. And a little bit of a sneak peek, the upcoming episodes, we're going to be talking to a combination of somebody very interesting from Spotify. We will be talking to Melissa Perry and Jeff Patton in the upcoming weeks as well, which will all be very exciting episodes. So make sure to hit the meetup button and join us for future events. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us. See you all when you're older. Have fun. Bye.
Goodbye.
Good night.